Hello, my name's Mike Covell. I am a local historian, researcher and writer, and I'm from Kingston upon Hull. Working on shows like Most Haunted and stuff like that were just fantastic. These were shows that, as a researcher, I grew up watching on TV. I'd read the books and things like that, so to go and work on the show and work with the people was just a dream come true, really. With Most Haunted, I worked on a show that we filmed from the Aniston building, which is a property in Hull. Carl Beattie left behind the official Most Haunted Ouija board, which was autographed by cast and crew, as well as a number of famous individuals that had worked on the show, and I looked after it for him. And when he returned back to Hull, I handed it over to him, and he was really surprised, and I think at that point he saw that I could be a trusted character. So one of the main things I do when it comes to history is I like to research properties that have either a dark history or are linked to paranormal activity. And what I like to do is go into the archives and look at things like the trade directories, the polling books, the electoral rolls, and build up a timeline of events and a timeline of people that worked there, that lived there, and ultimately that died there as well. There is sort of a detective element involved. Many of these cases, they've never really had their history looked at before. So to go back and to look at these sources and find stuff, I have what I call a eureka moment where, it might be that a specific room in a property is haunted, and I go in the archives and find this old newspaper clipping that no one's looked at for a century that talks about someone dropping down dead in there or things like that. So there are moments where you find stuff that's really amazing. When we talk about ghosts, my theory is that a ghost is a spirit of a dead person. So when you go back through the history of Hull, you look at things like what has happened here that could have produced a dead person. When you go back, there's so much dark history with mass tragedy events where, hundreds of people, thousands of people were killed. So there's just layers and layers of dark history waiting to be uncovered. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so many places that have reported activity.
How do you think Mrs. Garbutt would feel about that? Oh.
Well, we've got our answer.
Where did that come from?
I thought that was up there.
Well, it's on the floor now.
It's on the floor now, okay.
Okay.
Do you think that's an answer, Mike?
Possibly, yeah.
Do you want to explain about her first then?
So we moved into this house a week before the Hull floods. Bradley woke up screaming one night, and when I went into his room, he said there was a man standing in his door with a bit of wood and he was banging it in his hand. A couple of days later, Alyssa, my daughter, woke up and she said there was an old lady that sings songs to her and we took her into bed on a night. And then one night, Bradley woke up screaming, and when I ran in his room to hug him, he wouldn't tell me what it was because he was too scared. And when he finally got round to telling me, he put his head on my shoulder and he whispered into my ear, "He's behind you." And I looked and there was no one there. So I went to the archives, started researching the property, and I found a newspaper report in the Hull Times, and it basically said there was a murder on the street, and I thought that's really interesting. So I followed up the story and printed off all the newspaper reports, and basically on April 1st, 1945, Fred Watson, who was a lodger and a fitter, came into this property, and he went upstairs and grabbed an axe and he went into the living room and he put it through Mrs. Garbutt's head 6 times. He then dragged her body into the rear room, which is the room we're sat in right now, switched on the gas taps and tried to gas himself, then took a rusty knife and tried to cut his wrists. The police arrested him and took him to the hospital on Beverley Road. He escaped from the hospital and ran down Beverley Road towards the city centre, but at that time, Norfolk Street Police Station was there. And as the police station was there, they ran up the street, arrested him, took him back to the hospital. They bandaged his wrists up, sent him to the police courts where they declared him guilty but insane, sent him to the asylum, and as soon as he got there he killed himself. So that was the first part of the story, but the second part of the story was we wondered where the husband was. Why is he not living with her? This was just after the Second World War, so initially we thought maybe he was killed in the war. I went back to the archives, and in 1929 I discovered that Ernest Garbutt walked out the property and was never seen alive again. His body was pulled from the Humber, and it looked like it'd been beat up and thrown into the Humber. So the property was linked to a murder, a suicide, and a suspicious death. We contacted our local church, who put us in touch with the Diocese of York. They sent they call him a diocesan exorcist, and he came and did a blessing, got rid of Mr. Watson. Mrs. Garbutt, he said, was really happy being here, so he said she can stay. So occasionally in this room you get the smell of sort of lavender. Sometimes you hear a lady singing, and occasionally you get stuff like that happening where things do fly off and things. And so yeah, really interesting. When people think of a haunted house, they think of like horror movies and stuff like that. It's nothing like that. We do occasionally get stuff like that. Things go missing a lot in the house. Things get moved. There are weird moments, but it's never threatening, it's never scary. I spend a lot of time on my own in here, and I've never felt scared or anything like that by what goes on in the house. It's like the property picked me. You know, who else would have uncovered that story, you know, and gone into the archives and found all those newspaper reports and been able to tell her story. You know, every year on April 1st we light a candle. On a couple of occasions I've done live streams where I've shown people around where things happened and things like that. And then obviously, because of the kind of job that I do, I've invested in paranormal equipment and stuff, so occasionally we've set stuff up and see if that gets triggered and whatnot. Yeah, well, I've featured Mrs. Garbutt's story in several books, so her story will live on for future generations to read. I've always had an interest in UFOs from the age of 8. As a teenager I joined the Hull UFO Society, and that was wonderful. I went on loads of sky watches and things like that. Over the years I'd collected books and newspaper clippings, magazine articles and things like that. One of the reasons I got into this was when I was 8, I saw a giant egg floating over East Hull, and I told my dad, and instead of my dad saying, you know, it was an airship or a weather balloon or a helicopter, it gave me a book called The Book of the Unexplained, and I read it from cover to cover and just became really interested. And from then, over the years, you know, there was a few things. The old house I lived at had paranormal activity. You know, we moved into another house on Durham Street that had paranormal activity. So things does tend to follow you. There's weird coincidences as well. Lots and lots of weird coincidences that when they happen you would think, you know, that's a bit strange, but it's become part and parcel of my life, and it's interesting when those coincidences take place, and especially when other people are present as well and they get to experience it with you and see it firsthand. But there's been a lot of those where stuff's happened that I can't explain, but it's part of the journey. A few years ago I'd read an article by a lady called Jill Adams, who was a local playwright, and she used to work for the Hull Daily Mail, and Jill had written about UFOs in Hull. And one day I was lecturing about Jack the Ripper at the Hull History Centre, and Jill was in the audience, and she came to me after the show. We immediately hit it off, we became really good friends, and we stayed in touch. Jill had come up with an idea about Jack the Ripper herself and approached me, and I helped her with her project on Jack the Ripper. Unbeknown to me, Jill Adams has a wonderful daughter named Lucy Beaumont. And Lucy Beaumont, of course, from Meet the Richardsons and Infinite Monkey Cage. And Lucy was interested in making a show about UFOs. So Jill video called me and in quite a surreal conversation said, would you like to appear on the show? So they came, they filmed it in this office. We had a wonderful time. We spent most of the time laughing between takes and things like that. And they filmed a segment in Hull about a 1967 UFO sighting that took place. And what was interesting about that, this was a case that I'd worked on to try and prove or disprove. But this was a case that Jill Adams knew about because she lived local to the case. So it was really interesting that all our paths crossed at that moment. And it was such a wonderful show to work on. We just had so much fun filming it. I like giving people a voice. So a lot of the stuff I work on, these are victims that have died in quite sinister, quite sudden tragedies, and they've been taken away. And over the years, the stories have become convoluted or they've become mixed up. People tend to mix up history quite a lot in Hull. So to be able to go away and tell their story and research the people as humans, basically, is just wonderful. And it's you get a great feeling. And especially when the stories are published and the families get in touch. You know, and I've had families contact me, and sometimes it's just 2 words. You know, they'll drop me an inbox and they'll just say those 2 words and it'll be thank you. And that's just lovely, you know. And I've had quite emotional days where I've met families at gravesides, and yeah, it's nice to be able to share their journey and add those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to their story.